Is the battery dead?
Yeah, I hear you now.
Oh.
Okay.
Sweet.
Thanks everybody for coming out tonight. Appreciate it. If you haven't found the food already, there's stuff over there. There's also some various drinks in the fridge over there, so if you want to grab something. Tonight we're going to have Mangesh talk to us a little bit about being an improved developer, or I guess the path to being an improved developer, some of the stuff he's learned over the past year or so, improving his skills. I do want to mention, is anybody in here currently hiring?
Actually, recruiters, so we have a ton of different opportunities.
Okay. Do you have any of them off the top of your head, or?
Yeah, well, we've got one that's actually probably heard about it in downtown Dallas. This is one of our clients. They just relocated their headquarters here from San Francisco, and it's pretty cool there. We actually got to go on site, and they're pretty much your idea of a California IT company. It's a cool atmosphere out there, but they're actually looking for senior level, mid to senior level PHP developers. Right now, we're reviewing contract hires.
Perfect. If you wouldn't mind grabbing me after, I'll get some more details from you. Yeah. And if anybody else is currently looking, I won't ask you to raise your hand or anything. If you want to send an email to this address, we kind of try to connect you with the various recruiters and people around the area that are looking right now. Anyway, I will hand it over. All right, are you good?
Yeah.
Mirrored or anything? Are you all right?
I think if once I do present.
You got it on there? Okay.
Let's see. No, there should be another window. Let's go back. Okay, so we should be good. Okay.
All yours.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming. Our presentation today is PHP++, the path to an improved developer. First, I want to say thank you for the organization for giving me an opportunity to speak here today. So my name is Mangesh Sangapu. I grew up in the Midwest. My experience has been in C++ and PHP. My hobbies are outside of being a developer. I like film, videography, and electronics. And I wrote electronics really small because I'm just now sort of getting into it. I just got a BeagleBone Black, and so I'm looking forward to building some cool projects. So if you guys have BeagleBone Black or Raspberry Pi, please talk to me afterwards because I want to do some cool projects. So the journey begins. I downloaded PHP, and boom, I became a PHP developer. So who's to say otherwise? I mean, you really can't because I'm writing PHP. Here's a quote from the book, PHP Objects, Patterns, and Practice. The problem is that PHP is just too easy. It tempts you to try out your ideas and flatters you with good results. You write much of your code straight into your web pages, and that's exactly what I was doing. So the great thing about PHP can also be the bad thing about PHP. So my journey has been very much iterative. The way I started building my skill set in PHP is sort of described here, starting with Hello World, getting an education, taking on small projects, networking with others, and most recently attending conferences. So in each of these points in the journey, I feel like I've grown as a developer, and I wanted to share some of those things that I've learned. And in case you're confused, this is not the journey that I'm talking about. I'm talking about a different journey. So back to conferences. Lone Star, which was held here locally, took place back in April. I think most of you guys were there. It was great to meet other developers that are experiencing and solving the same problems as I was. There were even people from out of the country. The talks that I really enjoyed are listed here. clean application development, developing beautiful measurable software, your inner sysadmin, refactor, don't rebuild, continuous integration. So after the conference, I presented a short summary to my colleagues. So this presentation is an extension of that talk. I've added a lot more content and a little more depth to this talk. But due to the multitude of topics and for the sake of time, there are some areas that I will detail and other areas that I will summarize. If I went to detail about each and every topic, it'll probably take a few days to a couple weeks. All right, so the outline for this talk. First, I'm going to talk about bad code, so defining bad code, how to write high-quality code, and tools to facilitate development. So in order to improve as a developer, one must find areas of improvement. In order to define those areas, we need to define bad code and good code. Examples of bad code would be components listed here. If you're interested in learning more about any of these, please Google them. But examples are incomplete error handling, exception handling, memory leaks, race conditions, notices, warnings, fatal errors, globals used, inconsistent naming conventions, inconsistent standards, uninitialized variables, unused initialized variables, code lacking a purpose, functions do more than one thing, and too many comments. The ones in red are a bit more critical than the ones in orange, and I'm going to cover a couple of these. So if you do end up writing bad code, generally this guy shows up at my desk and he's like, I'm going to need you to come in on Saturday. And I'm like, no, I have plans, but okay, I will. So let's briefly look at two of these components. The first is naming conventions. So here we have some variables. So if you compare duration versus elapsed time in seconds, you also have duration seconds. Obviously, one is a lot more clear than the other. Same thing with product, product info, product data, product description. Product really doesn't say much if it has description. So obviously, product description would be a lot better. Same thing with classes and methods. You want your class names to be nouns, like customer, account, product, company. You want your method names to be verbs, get, close, add, get customer, close account, add company. So this will give your code base some consistency. So PHP sometimes makes people array happy. And here's a picture of that, array happy. So we have an alternative using objects. So in the first scenario, it's just an array with the keys name, the keys detailed, right? With all the. Is it hard to see that? Okay. Well, I don't know what I can do at this point, but just imagine you have an array. So at the top here. Oh, okay. Sweet. So at the top here, you have this a constructor that's setting variables to, I mean, it's setting different variables. But if you look at what it's passing in, it's passing in an array of credentials. And it's looking at the key server, user, password, source name, et cetera, right? If you mistype any of those keys, the code still goes on. But whereas if you use an object, if you mistype any of those keys, you're going to get an error. So it's a little scary when you use arrays and not objects. And this is an example of what can happen. So those are just two of the basic things. And as I mentioned, there's a ton more. And if you're interested in learning more about these, please Google them. So these are just some of the basic items. And so in order to improve, you basically want to understand and code the basics. Basically work on the basics until they become basic instincts. So how does bad code even get there? Causes of bad code are short deadlines. It's easy to do. Maybe I'm just feeling lazy one day. Maybe you don't know, there's a lack of how-to, maybe it wasn't architected properly. Maybe you feel you can come back and clean it up later. So some of the effects of bad code, you have wasted time, excessive debugging, bugs, missed deadlines, technical debt, financial losses. So what should we do with bad code? So you have an option. Do you want to rewrite or do you want to refactor? And really, it's up to you. You'll have to determine which path you want to take. And there are probably going to be revenue implications either way. So if you decide to rewrite, don't forget the main reasons that you're rewriting. Mainly what happens is when you rewrite code due to a problem, but that same problem is never resolved in the rewritten code. So the rewritten code is not any better than the previous code. So even though you rewrote something, you still have the same problem. And these popular examples of Netscape and Microsoft Pyramid. For Netscape, they spent 3+ years on a rewrite for version 6, and it actually flopped on release because other browsers were advancing. There's a lot of information on this online as well. So yeah, this is what not to do. So Microsoft Pyramid, they spent 18 months and with 200 software engineers, and the project was canceled. So don't rush into rewriting. You should refactor when possible, and hopefully you'll have some time and money savings and maybe some sanity as well. So refactoring is a very large topic. And in July, we had a talk by Paul Jones. It was actually here. And he spoke about how to rewrite small changes at a time. And if you're interested, please check out this link. The slides are going to be posted, so if you don't have a chance to write it down, it'll be available. And the talk by Paul Jones was really awesome. I mean, he talks about how to make a small change at a time. So each sprint or each life cycle, you can maybe spend an hour or two refactoring, and that way you won't spend a tremendous time doing it all at once. So here's a quick recap of just the last few slides. We looked at some components of bad code. From those components, to write clean code, all you have to do is avoid writing bad code. Then we looked at, then I spoke about where rewrite projects failed. And definitely be sure to check out Paul's talk on refactoring. Yeah, he talks about a lot of how to make small, minute changes. So what's next? High quality code. So here's some of the things that I've come across that have helped me grow. Principles, standards, frameworks, design and architectural patterns, test-driven development, peer code review. And these are very long topics, so I'm only going to talk about each of these briefly. I could probably spend hours, days, weeks on this stuff. So I'm not going to cover the OO principles, but please remember that there's a difference between class-oriented programming versus object-oriented programming. But I will summarize the SOLID principle. So SOLID is an acronym. So the first one is S for single responsibility. Each class has a single purpose. All its methods should relate to function to that purpose. The open-close principle. Classes or methods should be open for extension and closed for modification. So basically, once they're written, they should be only touched to fix errors. New functionality should go into new classes that are derived. We have the Liskov substitution, which defines subsets of functionality as interfaces. And the reasoning is small specific interfaces lead to a more decoupled system than a big general purpose one. Then the last one is a dependency inversion principle. So high-level modules should not depend on low-level modules. And this is kind of like if you're familiar with dependency injection or constructor injection. Instead, it should depend on abstractions. Abstractions should not depend on details. Details should depend on abstractions. So coding standards. So there's a group, PHP Fig, the Framework Interoperability Group. Is a group where representatives from various frameworks are working together to develop common standards among their code. There's a lot of, I think, frameworks such as like Symfony, Laravel, Zend, I think Zend 2. They're all part of this group. So they've come up with these common standards. So PSR 0 aims to provide a standard file, class, namespace, convention to allow plug-and-play code. PSR 1 aims to ensure a high level of technical interoperability between shared PHP code. So PSR 2, it's a coding style guide for projects looking to standardize their code. PSR 3 describes a common interface for logging libraries. PSR 4 is a modern take on autoloading advances in the system. So you don't have to only adhere to these standards, but doing so will give you some commonalities with frameworks that are already existing. But the most important thing to remember about coding standards is to pick one and stick with it. So depending on what you're trying to accomplish, you may or may not need a framework. If you have a large project, please use a framework. Don't try to create your own. Unless, of course, you're actually developing your own framework, which then it's different. And here's some of the frameworks listed. I think these are some of the popular ones. Symfony, Zend 2, Laravel is the new one. Yi, CodeIgniter. There's a ton more out there. So where are we? Okay, so high quality code, principles, standards, frameworks. So what's next? So up next we have design patterns, TDD, and peer reviews. So design patterns, apologize, the URL is, I think it's cut off. Actually it may not be, but yeah, so on Wikipedia, it has a pretty good link to different design patterns like creational, behavioral, etc. So by definition, a design pattern is a general reusable solution to a commonly occurring problem. Patterns are formalized best practices that the programmer can use to solve common problems. These aren't mandatory, but they're based on use cases. So there's a ton of information online regarding design patterns. I'm actually going to speak to one of them. I wanted to cover one pattern which I thought was pretty useful. The reasoning behind the factory is that it's to define an interface for creating an object, but let the classes that implement that interface decide which class to instantiate. So the factory method lets a class defer instantiation to its subclasses. So I'm going to show an example here. So you own an online store that sells different types of chocolates. You have a page where you're handling the products. And so you have this chocolate controller. So right now you only have, let's say you only have two products. You have dark chocolate and white chocolate. But as your store grows, as you get more products, your code is also going to grow and your controller is going to grow. So now you have more chocolates defined here. You have dark, white, coconut, peanuts, caramel. So you can see this is going to get pretty big just in the controller. So the factory pattern. So compare this with the previous code. You have the factory pattern here, and your controller is actually creating those classes. Let's see. Right here. So when you compare this to this that keeps growing, I mean, obviously, factory pattern has a lot less code. And regardless of how many products you have, your controller is not going to expand. It's not going to get any bigger than this, which is one of the great things about factory. So you have to think of design patterns as like enhanced object-oriented programming. So now that we've discussed these topics, let's not forget the last two, TDD and code reviews. By the way, does anybody have any questions? Okay. Yeah, so let's not forget the last two, TDD and code reviews. Anyone done this before?
Oh, I'm pretty sure I posted that image on Twitter multiple times.
Well, I've definitely done this before. So TDD. So TDD was a very common theme at Lone Star, especially if you had to, if you have a build system like Jenkins. So test-driven development, it's a process, and it's exactly what it sounds like. You write tests upfront before any development takes place. So at the start, all of your tests should fail. And as you develop to pass one test at a time. And that's basically the gist of TDD. TDD makes your code simpler, more defensive, less feature creep. This is because you only need to write the code to pass the tests. And you don't have to write anything else. And that way you can also ensure that your build is going to pass. So code review. So why is code review important? I mean, you don't have to do it, right? But what if you find a bug and that's in production? It's the night after deployment, and it's like, oh crap, there's a bug, and I wrote it. So code reviewing is important. The cost of fixing a bug up front is important because if we don't find the bug till after the release, you're going to spend more time fixing it. You might pull it into your sprint or your life cycle. So it's better to take an extra 10, 30 minutes, an hour, however long it takes up front, than to introduce a defect into your life cycle. So then we have some tools to facilitate development. PHP unit, I think that's one of the popular testing frameworks. We have PHP LOC for analyzing projects. Cyclomatic complexity, dependencies. There was a couple talks at the conference that spoke about cyclomatic complexity and NPath. There's also BHAT, testing framework, PHP analyzer, which does analysis, type inference, looks at suspicious code, deprecated functions, framework checks. There's also something I came across recently, deoxygen, and it has a pretty nice call graph. Just displays what methods and what classes are being accessed. And it prints out a pretty nice and pretty graph, and you can it's very visual, so it's really cool. So more tools. So a PHP mess detector. So this checks code size, complexity, design, unused code, naming conventions. You have PHP code sniffer. We actually use this at our company, but we currently have it turned off. There's a big battle going on right now. Okay, so it's for syntax checking, anything from white space to document comments to variable naming conventions. There's also a PHP copy paste detector, PHP dead code detector, which if there's code that's not being used, it'll detect it. PHP copy paste, obviously, if you're just copying and pasting code all over your code base, that's a good way to find it. So even more tools. PHP depend, code analysis, code rank, other metrics, continuous integration. How many of you guys are familiar with continuous integration or use it at work? You guys use Jenkins? Okay, cool. Yeah, so I mean, it has integration for standards, code sniffer, HipChat integration. We also use HipChat, coincidentally. So we're trying to make it right now is where whenever there's a build that started, we get an alert in HipChat, or whenever we create a story, that the story branch is automatically created on the in a repository. PHP Storm. I actually use this ID. Anybody else use this, PHP Storm? Okay, sweet, sweet. That's awesome. Yeah, it has an integration for coding standards as well. There's other colleagues that use Eclipse. That's also pretty popular. But I really enjoy PHP Storm. There's a lot of nice features. So tools for logging. There's log rotate, which will rotate the logs. So if your log file is getting like really huge, you can swap it out. There's log watch, scripts that runs at intervals to email a summary of events. You also have OSEC, the host intrusion detection system. And it does this by watching logs, and it can send you immediate alerts. So TDD, code review, and tools. So in the last couple slides, we talked about those things. So high quality code and clean applications. So using principles, standards, and frameworks, patterns, clean code is possible. The effects of clean, high quality code. You have a shorter development time. Onboarding of developers is easier. You have less bugs. Happier end users, predictable schedules, the right thing to do. So the journey I discussed today went something like this. Your journey is probably going to be different. The goal is to keep improving oneself. So good luck on your journey. So unfortunately, it's only been 25 minutes, and I'm at the end of the slides. So this is the end. So sorry, I went. Yeah, sorry, Jake. Go ahead.
How do you handle code reviews at your job?
We have an application called Crucible. Do you guys use that as well? Okay, that's how we handle it. So we basically just go in there, look at our latest commits, and then assign it to another person. So at the beginning of our sprints, we randomly pick a developer that's going to do our review. So it's not always the same one, or always the same person. So based on that, we assign it to a certain person in Crucible. So that gets assigned.
Do you do it per story or per commit? How do you guys do it?
Right now, we're doing it per story, but we generally like to do it right before the commit. That way, it's code complete.
Before the merge?
I'm sorry, yes. After the commit, but before the merge. Okay. That's correct. Yes, yes.
Generally, how big are the commits that you're dealing with for code review?
It depends. So it goes back to our story size. So we typically try not to take on story points greater than 13. We consider those epics. So we try to keep our story small. So based on that, the review should be, they should be okay. But yeah, I mean, I've had instances where stories touched a couple files and instances where stories touched maybe 15 files. So it just depends. But we try to keep it small based on the story points. Any other questions?
Out of the tools that you mentioned, how many of them do you guys actually use?
Well, we don't use Kanye West just yet. Let's see. We use PHP Unit. The Oxygen, our architect uses that. PHP Code Sniffer, but right now there's a big battle going on, so we've turned it off for the time being.
What's the battle about?
Well, the battle is about code quality versus coding styles. So,
What do you mean?
well, my counterpart isn't here, so I can't explain the other part. So our architect feels that writing good code is more important than syntax and formatting. And so he's under the impression that code sniffer is largely just mainly for styles and formatting. Where does the curly brace go? How many tabs are here?
Right. It doesn't affect the quality of the code, but the fact that you have inconsistencies everywhere is the problem. You want your code base to look like one developer wrote it, not 30.
Right. Yes, I understand. So you'd be on my side of the
Yeah,
table when I'm talking. Let's see what else. So Jenkins, PHP Storm, but that's just an IDE. So those are some of the tools that we're using. I know we also have something like log rotate. I don't know if it's exactly log rotate, but I know our log files are kept pretty small. Oh yeah, that's right. We also use our DB client. It's called DBeaver it's on the Mac OS. And I'm not sure about in terms of like security wise. I think our infrastructure team uses something like this. If there's any attempts into the system. Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, we also have Splunk. What's the other one? We have.
Not everybody can afford Splunk.
Is
It's nice. It is nice.
that the one that sends us the emails? Isn't there one more? Sentry. That's right, Sentry. I need to add those. Did you guys like the pictures?
Yeah.
I need to add more.
So what were some of the toughest things? So you took in all this information for the conference, and you came back and presented to your team. What were some of the hardest things getting implemented or pushing the team to kind of do that you're possibly not currently doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the things we're working on right now is the coding standards, and I think that's very important. We're also building our build system. We have a DevOps guy that's working on that right now, and I think once we get that up and going, right now it's a battle with.
We have currently a cruise control. We're moving towards Jenkins.
Right. So so he's building Jenkins right now. So right now it's getting the infrastructure in place, and hopefully once that, we also use Jira for tools for our stories. So once we have all that, once we have Jenkins in place, we're hoping whenever there's a story branch, whenever we start a story, it creates a branch in a repository, which I think we started doing that this week.
Jira APIs will allow to create on the Git story branches. Like when you
That's
make
right.
a task on a story, it will automatically create that branch on the Git.
By the way, this is my colleague Raju, so that's why he knows so much about what I do. Yeah, so once Jenkins is up and running, we're also hoping that whenever we start off a build, that it'll send us a notification in the chat room. The chat room is, we're all watching it. So we're trying to do some things like that. One thing I feel is very important is TDD, and I don't feel like we do enough of that. Even though the test cases are written in advance, some of the developers, they don't go into our test system and look at the cases and write code to actually pass those tests. They're just developing, and at the end they go back and they'll be like, okay, well, I need to pass this. So we're still a little premature in terms of the build system. It's not completely set yet. We're transitioning from one build system to another. So that's where we see some of these problems. But hopefully when it's all set up and done, we'll be able to do that.
With your code standards, were you guys trying to implement your own, or were you actually kind of trying to follow like a PSR2 or Zend or Pear or one of those?
That's a good question. So we basically had these standards from a company that we acquired, and we took over the code base. So they already had some standards in place. So we actually had to ask one of them to go and detail what standards are currently there.
So was it actually in Code Sniffer, or just they just written in some kind of wiki somewhere?
It was in Code Sniffer.
Okay.
Yeah, it was in Code Sniffer, but we had them document it, so we actually understood it. Yeah, yeah, which I think is important to do that as well. Yeah. So, yeah.
Can you describe like what you did exactly as far as like trying to entice an employer to give you a chance with PHP or
That's a great question. So some of the things I mentioned, actually one thing I mentioned earlier, let me go back to this slide. So taking on small projects, networking with other PHP developers, and attending conferences. The projects, I feel like they really helped quite a bit. And these are projects outside of work. So it really showed others that I was interested in PHP and not just wanting to do what I had to do at work, but I would go out and find other projects that I was interested in. Maybe it was an e-commerce site. Right now, I work at a company and we do web applications, so I'm not doing e-commerce anymore. So last year I did an e-commerce site for someone that was with PHP and MySQL. So taking on projects like that outside of work, I think that helps. It also helps pad your resume a little bit. You can say, well, I did this. Helps you wear different hats than you might wear at work. At work, you might be just limited to, okay, you have to do this, here's your requirements. But if you take on a project, you might be the analyst, you might be the developer, the tester, you might be all of those hats, right? So I think that really helped a lot. Because it is, I think, difficult if you're starting out in PHP to build up a resume.
Where did you find projects to contribute to?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Where did you find projects?
Where did I find projects? Well, I mean, you can find them in many ways. I can find them online. Let's see, back in the day, I started on Craigslist. I said, hey, I'm a developer. This is what I can do. Here's some samples. If you're interested, send me an email. And I got tons of emails. And I still do this at time to time. I mean, I always want to continue growing my skills. I don't ever want to be like that stale developer that I'm only going to do this much. I always want to, learn new technology and keep improving. And I really enjoy, taking on projects, and which helps me a lot to do that. So, cool. Good questions. Any other questions? Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, guys.